She thought she could laugh her way out of court, until the judge did something that wiped the smirk off her face. The courtroom in Phoenix, Arizona, hummed with an almost suffocating stillness. Rows of wooden benches, filled with spectators and legal professionals, seemed to hold their collective breath as the next case was called. The heavy oak door creaked open, and Jessica Phillips strutted inside, flipping her platinum blonde hair over one shoulder. She wasn't nervous, she wasn't even pretending to be. If anything, she looked bored. She chewed on a piece of gum, hands tucked in the pockets of her oversized hoodie, the kind of outfit more suited for a coffee run than a courtroom appearance. As she stepped up to the defendant's table, she popped a bubble, drawing a sharp glance from the bailiff. She just smirked. Seated at the bench was Judge Elijah Stone. Late 50s, sharp brown eyes, a face carved with years of unwavering authority. He had seen it all: career criminals, remorseful first-timers, men who wept, and women who lied through gritted teeth. But today, what stood before him was something different. Jessica Phillips, charged with disorderly conduct, resisting arrest, and public intoxication. Nothing that screamed high profile. But what made this case interesting wasn't the charges. It was her attitude. Judge Stone cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses as he peered down at her. Miss Phillips, do you understand the charges against you? Jessica shifted her weight to one hip. Yeah, I get it. The courtroom rustled. A few murmurs passing through the audience. The defense attorney beside her, David Laskin, swallowed hard and whispered, "Jessica, be respectful." She gave him a look. One of those looks entitled girls give when they don't think they need advice from anyone. Then, without missing a beat, she turned back to the judge and rolled her eyes. Judge Stone took a deep breath. Miss Phillips, this is a courtroom, not a reality show. I suggest you answer properly. Jessica smirked. All right, fine, yes, Your Honor, she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. I understand the charges. There was a pause, the kind that made the air feel too thick. Judge Stone leaned forward slightly. I see. And do you understand what could happen if you're found guilty? Jessica shrugged. Community service. Maybe a fine. I mean, let's be real. It's not like I robbed a bank. A few gasps flickered through the room. Laskin turned pale. This was bad. Judge Stone held his gaze on her, unwavering. Unreadable. That's not for you to decide. Miss Phillips, it's for this court. Jessica huffed, shifting her stance again, clearly annoyed that this was taking so long. Right, whatever you say, Your Honor. She gave a half-hearted little bow. Like this was some joke. The moment stretched, tense and waiting. Judge Stone didn't speak immediately. Instead, he let the weight of the room settle in, let her feel the quiet, the power of the court. Finally, he spoke. Miss Phillips, I've been on this bench for over 2 decades. In that time, I've seen many defendants, some worse than you, some better, but I'll tell you this, disrespect doesn't get you very far in my courtroom. Jessica tilted her head. Well, maybe if this place wasn't so serious all the time, people wouldn't be so grumpy. A sharp inhale from the prosecution table. Judge Stone didn't react. He simply studied her, as if dissecting the layers of arrogance beneath her carefully crafted nonchalance. Miss Phillips, I suggest you start treating this situation with the seriousness it demands, because if you don't, you may not like where this goes. Jessica grinned. Oh, is that a threat? Judge. Silence. Thick, heavy silence. Judge Stone's expression remained composed, his voice level. No, Miss Phillips, that's a fact. But Jessica, oblivious, just laughed, and just like that, the air in the courtroom shifted. The storm had only just begun. A quiet murmur rippled through the room. A few people shook their heads. Others exchanged glances. A bailiff near the bench stiffened. No one spoke. But they all felt it. Jessica Phillips had no idea what she had just walked into. Judge Elijah Stone sat back in his chair. His fingers steepled. He had dealt with all kinds of defendants, hardened criminals, frightened teenagers, remorseful adults. But arrogance like this, it was different. This girl wasn't just careless. She was daring him to lose his temper. He wouldn't. He never did. Instead, he exhaled slowly, then turned his attention to the prosecution. Mr. Keating, you may proceed. District Attorney Mark Keating, a tall, balding man in his early 40s, stood and straightened his tie. Thank you, Your Honor. He turned to Jessica. Miss Phillips, let's go over the events of last Friday night, shall we? Jessica groaned dramatically. Oh, do we have to? It's such a blur. The prosecutor's jaw tightened. It's important for the record. She sighed loudly. Fine. Tossing her hair back, she crossed her arms. I went out with some friends. We had a couple drinks. And then some overly dramatic cop decided I was being, I don't know, disruptive. She made air quotes, rolling her eyes again. Keating's face remained neutral. You were standing on top of a parked car, screaming profanities at pedestrians. Jessica smirked. Allegedly. Keating blinked. It's on video. Jessica shrugged. Well, maybe people shouldn't record everything. Judge Stone adjusted his glasses. Miss Phillips, I would highly recommend taking this seriously. Oh, come on. She threw her hands up. I was just having fun. It's not like I hurt anyone. The only thing I'm guilty of is maybe being a little too loud. Keating's expression darkened. You resisted arrest, Miss Phillips. You shoved an officer. Jessica gave an exaggerated gasp, placing a hand over her chest. Oh no, I shoved someone. Lock me up forever. Laskin, her defense attorney, visibly flinched. He leaned toward her, whispering frantically, Jessica, stop, right now. She ignored him. Judge Stone, however, remained eerily calm. Bailiff, please play the footage. The uniformed officer walked over to the screen in the corner and pressed play. The room fell silent. The video showed a very different version of events than the one Jessica was trying to sell. A shaky phone recording captured her standing on the hood of a red sedan, swinging a half-empty bottle of vodka as she screamed at pedestrians when the police arrived. She threw the bottle, barely missing an officer's head. Then, as they tried to pull her down, she shoved one of them back so hard he nearly fell. The video ended with Jessica being dragged, kicking and cursing, to the ground, watching herself on screen. Jessica let out a nervous little laugh. Well, that's embarrassing. Judge Stone's voice was measured, calm. Absolute. Mr. Keating, what are the potential penalties for Miss Phillips' charges? Keating nodded. If convicted, she could face up to 6 months in county jail, along with mandatory community service and a substantial fine. Jessica's smirk faltered. Just slightly. Judge Stone caught it. Something funny, Miss Phillips? Jessica forced a grin. I mean, come on, jail for that, that's a little extreme, don't you think? The judge's stare could have split stone. Do you know what I think is extreme? Jessica blinked. I think standing on a car in public, throwing a bottle at an officer, shoving law enforcement, and treating a courtroom like a high school cafeteria is extreme. The room felt smaller somehow. The spectators leaned in. Jessica shifted in her seat. Look, I didn't mean. I don't care what you meant. Judge Stone cut in, his voice low and sharp. I care about the law. Jessica's mouth opened, then closed for the first time. Her confidence cracked. Judge Stone glanced at the bailiff. Take her into custody. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Jessica's head snapped up. Wait, what? No, 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 you can't be serious. But Judge Stone was already standing, collecting his papers. The gavel hadn't dropped yet, and Jessica had no idea what was coming next. The courtroom erupted. Jessica shot up from her seat, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. Hold on, you're actually locking me up for this? Judge Stone didn't flinch. Bailiff, take the defendant into custody for contempt of court. The uniformed officer moved toward her. For the first time, real panic flashed across Jessica's face. No. Wait. You can't do that. She stumbled back, bumping into her defense attorney, David Laskin, who had turned pale. Your Honor, Laskin said quickly, stepping in front of his client. I understand the court's frustration, but I ask for leniency. Miss Phillips doesn't seem to grasp the severity of her situation. Judge Stone raised an eyebrow. I'd say that much is clear. Jessica clutched Laskin's arm. Yeah, what he said. Look, I was being stupid. Okay, but I don't deserve jail. Judge Stone tapped his fingers against the bench. Considering her, the bailiff had paused, waiting for the final word. A long silence stretched through the courtroom. Every spectator leaned forward, watching. Stone's eyes settled on Jessica, unreadable. Miss Phillips, are you finally beginning to understand where you are? Jessica swallowed. She nodded quickly, then realized what she had done. I mean, yes. Your Honor. His gaze remained locked on her. Do you know what contempt of court means? She hesitated. It means you're really mad at me. A few muffled laughs flickered through the courtroom. Judge Stone didn't break eye contact. It means you have disrespected this court. It means that, if I wanted to, I could have you escorted out in handcuffs this very moment. Jessica's stomach twisted. The fire in her head dimmed, but her mouth still ran ahead of her brain. Okay. But isn't that kind of extreme? Stone didn't blink. I could add 30 days to your sentence for every smart remark you make. Would that be extreme? Jessica felt a weight settle on her chest. Laskin whispered urgently. Jessica, stop talking. She pressed her lips together. Judge Stone exhaled. Shifting in his chair, he was silent for a moment, letting the weight of the situation sink in. Then, finally, he spoke. I'm not going to take you into custody. Jessica exhaled in relief, but too soon. Stone wasn't finished. Not yet. Her relief froze in place. The judge continued. Instead, I will give you one final warning. One chance to prove that you understand what's at stake here. Jessica nodded quickly. Got it. Yes, I totally understand. But Judge Stone wasn't convinced. I don't think you do. He said slowly, because if you did, you wouldn't be standing here still trying to minimize your actions. Jessica fidgeted, her confidence slipping like sand through her fingers. Judge Stone leaned forward, resting his elbows on the bench. So here's what's going to happen. You will sit down. You will remain silent unless spoken to. And if you so much as roll your eyes one more time, I will hold you in contempt and have you taken into custody immediately. Jessica's throat felt tight. Okay, she said softly. Stone wasn't done. And before we continue, I want to make something very clear. He let the silence stretch, ensuring she, and everyone else, was listening. This is not a joke. This is not a game. This is my courtroom, and in my courtroom, respect is not optional. Jessica's heartbeat thudded in her ears. She barely nodded. Good. Judge Stone straightened, his voice returning to its usual measured tone. Now, let's proceed. Jessica lowered herself into her chair. But for the first time that day, she did it without an attitude. But the real lesson was still coming. The tension in the courtroom lingered like a storm cloud, thick and charged. Jessica Phillips sat stiffly in her chair. Her earlier smugness drained from her face. She wasn't smiling anymore. Judge Elijah Stone had set the rules, loud and clear, and for the first time, Jessica actually seemed to be following them for now. Mr. Keating, the judge said, shifting his focus back to the prosecution. Continue. District Attorney Mark Keating adjusted his tie, his eyes flicking briefly toward Jessica. Gauging her sudden shift in demeanor, he wasn't convinced it would last. Your Honor, he began, the state is prepared to present witness testimony from the arresting officer, Sergeant Daniel Briggs. The side door opened, and a uniformed officer walked in, broad shoulders, a neatly trimmed mustache, and a demeanor that screamed authority. Jessica exhaled sharply. The sight of him seemed to stir something in her, though whether it was fear, irritation, or embarrassment, it was hard to tell. Briggs took the stand, placed his hand on the Bible, and was sworn in once seated. Keating stepped forward. Sergeant Briggs. Keating started. Can you describe what happened the night of Miss Phillips' arrest? Briggs nodded. I was responding to multiple complaints about a public disturbance outside a bar on Roosevelt Street. When I arrived, I saw the defendant, Miss Phillips, standing on top of a parked vehicle, screaming at pedestrians and throwing objects onto the sidewalk. Jessica shifted uncomfortably, but stayed quiet. Keating nodded. And what happened when you attempted to de-escalate the situation? Briggs exhaled sharply. I approached Miss Phillips and calmly instructed her to step down from the vehicle. She ignored me, waved a bottle of vodka in the air, and shouted obscenities at bystanders. A low murmur passed through the audience. Keating continued. At any point, did she indicate she intended to cooperate? Briggs's jaw tensed. Not even close. When I attempted to help her off the vehicle, she threw the bottle in my direction, barely missing my face. And when I reached for her arm, she shoved me with full force. Jessica closed her eyes for a second. Her fingers tightening around the edge of the table. Keating turned to the judge. Your Honor, the state would like to enter Exhibit B into evidence, body cam footage of the arrest. Judge Stone nodded once. Proceed. The courtroom screen flickered to life and suddenly, there was no denying the truth. The footage wasn't just bad, it was damning. Jessica, standing on the car, flailing her arms wildly, her words slurred. Briggs, calmly instructing her to get down. Jessica, laughing in his face. Then, the bottle flying through the air, shattering on the pavement. Briggs reaching for her. Jessica, shoving him back with enough force to make him stumble. The struggle. The officers pinning her to the pavement as she kicked and screamed, cursing them all. Then, the moment of absolute silence when the footage ended. Jessica's face was ashen. No charm. No smirk. No rolled eyes. Just the cold, undeniable reality of what she had done. Judge Stone folded his hands in front of him. Miss Phillips, do you still believe this is a misunderstanding? Jessica's voice caught in her throat. Laskin, her attorney, leaned in. Jessica, he whispered, this is your last chance to show some remorse. For the first time since stepping into the courtroom. She looked truly shaken. Her lips parted, then pressed together. She looked down at her hands. Then, finally, she spoke. Her voice was barely a whisper. I didn't think it was that bad. Judge Stone let her words settle in the air for a moment. Then, he spoke. It was. The room remained still. The weight of the moment pressing down on everyone inside. Jessica finally understood, but understanding wasn't the same as atonement, and the consequences were still coming. Jessica sat frozen, her breath coming in shallow bursts. The weight of what she had just seen, what everyone had just seen, pressed down on her like a boulder. The room was dead silent, the kind of silence that made her ears ring. Judge Elijah Stone didn't look angry. That was worse. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze still locked onto her. Miss Phillips, he said, his voice steady, measured, now that we've all seen the footage, do you have anything to say for yourself? Jessica swallowed hard. Her throat felt dry. She could feel the eyes of the entire courtroom on her, watching, waiting. Her voice wavered. Her attorney, David Laskin, shot her a glance, urging her to say something, anything, that showed real remorse. Jessica took a breath, trying to steady herself. I wasn't thinking. I didn't realize. She hesitated, her words hollow, uncertain. Judge Stone wasn't impressed. You didn't realize? He echoed, his voice laced with something that sounded dangerously close to disappointment. Tell me, Miss Phillips, what exactly did you think would happen when you stood on top of a stranger's vehicle, threw a bottle at an officer, and physically assaulted law enforcement? Jessica winced at the word assaulted. She didn't like hearing it, but it was the truth. I don't know. She stammered. Judge Stone cut her off. That's not good enough. Jessica flinched, heat creeping up her neck. The judge's voice remained calm, but there was an undeniable weight behind every word. You stood in this courtroom and mocked the authority of this court. You laughed. You rolled your eyes. You made a mockery of not just me, but of the law itself. Jessica shrank in her chair. Stone didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. You treated this as a joke. He continued, but I assure you, Miss Phillips, the consequences are very real. Jessica's fingers curled around the fabric of her hoodie. Knuckles white, she opened her mouth, trying to come up with something, anything, to lessen the damage, but there was no talking her way out of this. Judge Stone turned to the prosecution. Mr. Keating, does the state have a sentencing recommendation? Jessica's breath hitched. Sentencing? Keating stood, glancing briefly at her before addressing the court. Your Honor, given the defendant's lack of prior convictions, but also considering her blatant disregard for authority, the state recommends 3 months in county jail, followed by 1 year of supervised probation and mandatory community service. The words hit Jessica like a gut punch. Her head snapped up. Wait, what? Jail? Stone didn't react. He simply nodded. Noted. Jessica turned to her lawyer. Panicked. You have to do something. I can't go to jail. Laskin sighed, rubbing his temples. Jessica, this is serious. You should have listened earlier. She felt like the walls were closing in. This couldn't be happening. 3 months. No. No, Jessica snapped back to the judge. Please. I swear I wasn't trying to hurt anyone. I was drunk. I was stupid, but I don't deserve jail. Stone's gaze remained unreadable. And yet, when given the chance to take responsibility, you chose arrogance instead. Jessica's stomach dropped, but he continued. The entire courtroom held its breath. Jessica froze. Barely breathing, Stone exhaled, then straightened. Miss Phillips, I am not going to sentence you to 3 months in jail. Jessica felt like she could collapse in relief, but then, I am sentencing you to 1 full month in county jail, followed by 1 year of probation and 200 hours of community service. Jessica's relief shattered. Her mouth fell open. No. Please, Your Honor. Stone held up a hand. Miss Phillips, I strongly suggest you stop speaking before you make this worse for yourself. Jessica bit her tongue so hard it hurt. The judge turned to the bailiff. Take her into custody. Effective immediately. The bailiff stepped forward. Jessica squeezed her eyes shut, her heart hammering. This couldn't be real, but the cold steel of handcuffs against her wrists said otherwise, and in that moment, she understood. Actions have consequences, and no amount of charm could change that. It felt surreal a moment ago. She had been untouchable, or so she thought. Now, with the bailiff securing the handcuffs, the reality of her situation crashed down like a collapsing ceiling. She twisted slightly, feeling the sharp edge of metal press into her skin. Wait. Please, she breathed, her voice small. Just give me another chance. Judge Stone didn't move. His expression remained the same, calm, but resolute. There were plenty of chances, he said. You wasted them. The courtroom remained eerily silent. Even the spectators, once entertained by her antics, now looked at her differently, some with pity, others with nothing at all. Jessica turned desperately to her lawyer, David Laskin, but he had already stepped away from the table, rubbing his forehead. There was nothing more he could do. The bailiff's grip on her arm tightened slightly as he guided her toward the door. Jessica dug her heels in instinctively. No. Wait. Just listen. I swear I've learned my lesson. Please, Your Honor, I won't do it again. Stone didn't flinch. You're right, he said, because now, you'll have time to think about your choices. In a cell. Jessica felt a weight in her chest. A month in county jail. 30 days. It sounded like a death sentence to someone who had never spent a night in anything worse than a cheap motel. The bailiff continued forward, pulling her along. Panic gripped her throat. No. This isn't fair. I was just being stupid. She suddenly felt herself being turned around. The bailiff placed a firm hand on her shoulder, keeping her still. The next few moments happened so fast, it all felt like a blur. A second bailiff approached. Jessica Phillips, you are hereby remanded into custody. Her wrists were adjusted. The clinking sound of the cuffs being secured rang in her ears like gunfire. Jessica stared down at the floor, her breathing shaky. How had this happened just hours ago? She had been laughing, joking. She had walked into the courtroom convinced that the system would bend for her. Now she was about to be walked through a door that didn't open from the inside. Her stomach turned. She suddenly wished she could go back to the moment she rolled her eyes, back to when she had mocked the judge, back to when she still had a choice. Judge Stone adjusted his glasses. Miss Phillips, I hope you take this time to reflect, because I assure you, the next time you appear in a courtroom, your attitude will determine the rest of your life. Jessica bit the inside of her cheek to keep herself from crying, but it was too late the moment she was escorted toward the exit. The realization crushed her completely. She had played a game, and she lost, but the worst part, she had no one to blame but herself. The heavy metal door slammed shut behind her, sealing Jessica inside the sterile gray holding cell. The walls were cold, the air thick with the scent of disinfectant, and something stale, something she didn't want to identify. She sat on the thin cot, staring at nothing, her mind racing. The reality of her situation clawed at her, refusing to let go. This wasn't a joke anymore. The arrogance, the laughter, the sarcasm, none of it mattered now. She pulled her knees to her chest, her mind replaying every mistake like a broken record. She had been so sure she could charm her way through life, dodging consequences with a well-placed smirk. That had always been her strategy, but Judge Stone, he wasn't like the others. He had seen right through her, past the bravado, past the empty confidence, and he had made sure she saw herself. 30 days, it wasn't just about the time, it was about what it meant. She had mocked the law, spat in the face of authority, and believed she was untouchable. She wasn't. The sound of a buzzer jolted her. The guard's voice echoed down the hallway. Phillips. Stand up. Jessica hesitated, then obeyed as she stepped into the hall, shackles now binding her wrists and ankles. A wave of humiliation washed over her. This was real. A woman in a sharp suit, probation officer, maybe, stood waiting. Miss Phillips, she said, let's talk about your probation terms. Jessica nodded stiffly, suddenly too exhausted to fight back. She listened carefully, something she should have done in court. 200 hours of community service, supervised probation, a record that would follow her for years. And yet, as the woman spoke, one sentence stood out louder than the rest: if you violate your probation, you'll be back in front of Judge Stone. Jessica swallowed hard. She never wanted to sit in front of that man again. She wasn't sure if it was fear or respect, but she finally understood something she should have grasped long ago. Authority isn't meant to be mocked, consequences aren't meant to be avoided, and respect, it's earned, or it's enforced. She had learned that the hard way as the officer guided her toward another door. Jessica took one last glance at the cold walls of the detention center, and for the first time, she didn't roll her eyes. Life isn't about dodging consequences or seeing how far you can push authority. Respect matters, accountability matters, because one way or another, the world will teach you a lesson, and you won't always like how it's taught. If you found value in this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Have you ever seen someone learn a hard lesson the way Jessica did? Share your thoughts in the comments below.